Hi there, my name is Reverend Rick Brown and welcome to St. James United Church in Waterdown, Ontario, Canada. Change can sometimes feel painful, but not changing can be even more painful. I want to invite you to try an experiment with me here. Find yourself a comfortable place to sit. If you're not already sitting, make yourself comfortable. Do whatever you need to do to adjust yourself right now as you're listening to me until you feel perfectly comfortable. Now stay like that. Don't move. Don't move at all. Eventually, that comfortable position that you're now holding is going to start to feel uncomfortable if you don't shift at some point. And if you don't shift after that, that discomfort, it's going to start to feel stiff. And that stiffness, if you still don't shift, that's going to start to feel painful. And if you don't move after that, that pain is going to become agony. You see, agony comes from not changing. Change may be difficult, but not changing leads to agony. Change always involves giving something up in order to receive something new. And if we love the thing that we're giving up, even if we know that we need to give it up, we're still going to miss it terribly, and that's going to cause us to grieve. And so we can't ignore that change means loss. But it also means gain. God said to Isaiah in the passage that I read earlier, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, I'm doing a new thing. It's bursting forth right in the midst of you. Can't you see it? Hostility and danger, they're all around you, but I'm showing you a new path that will lead to long-term blessing. Don't be afraid, fear not, because I'm with you through all of this. Change can be painful, but not changing is even more painful in the long run. St. James has faced a lot of change throughout our history. And we've always been a congregation with the courage to change at the right time for the right reasons. And now we're doing it again. Back in 1996, for the 35th anniversary of this building here, Jean Wilson from our congregation said this: "History is a part of us all. All of us have a past. All of us have a future. As church people, it behooves us to look to our past as we move toward the future." Jean's right. So let's have a look to our past as we move towards the future. Our own Diane Woods and her late husband, Don, in their very excellent book, The Mills of Waterdown, they describe the earliest days of Waterdown here when Ebenezer Griffin moved into town and built the first of 8 mills along what we now call Grindstone Creek. Well, he didn't really move into town because the town didn't exist. Ebenezer was the son of a Methodist minister from Smithville, which is just south of Grimsby, and he ran the Sunday school there. Now, for our ancestors, the Methodist schools were actually more important to them than their churches. How you lived your faith on a daily basis was more important than gathering once a week to sing. Early Methodists, they gathered for what they call class meetings, where they would talk about their faith and how to put it into action. And they were served by a traveling preacher that was called a circuit rider, who would travel around the countryside, visiting from place to place, town to town, village to village, farm to farm, preaching to these clusters of Methodists. And they would meet wherever they could, whether it was in a tent or a barn or even out in the open, to hear these traveling preachers, the circuit riders. And then between the visits of the circuit riders, because they couldn't come every week when they were covering a whole area, then they would go back to their regular class meetings. So in 1823, Ebenezer arrived with his brother Absalom. Great old names there, eh? And they came to this area and they scouted out a location for their mill. And back then, mills attracted people. So when they built the mill, people were drawn to it, and eventually the village of Waterdown grew up around that mill and all the other mills that popped up. And in 1827, there was a schoolhouse built on the corner of the Grierson's farm. Ebenezer notes that the school on Grierson's farm was used on Sundays for worship. It was the place of worship for the Methodists on Sunday mornings and the Presbyterians on Sunday afternoons. So is that the beginning of our congregation? Is that the first meeting of our congregation? Well, not really, actually. There were already Methodists here when Ebenezer arrived, and they were already being served by a circuit rider preacher based out of Ancaster as early as 1796. But even that circuit from Ancaster in 1796 was really just a subdivision of an earlier circuit rider's route who used to cover all of the Niagara Peninsula, even as far as Hamilton and this area here. But when the population got bigger and that was too much for one circuit rider, then they broke up that circuit into smaller circuits, and we became part of the Ancaster circuit. So who knows when the first gatherings of Methodists in this area actually happened? We don't actually know. There's just no written record. So the truth is, we don't actually have any idea when our congregation started to meet. Now we do know, fast forward a little bit to 1843, after they had been worshiping in the school for at least 16 years, so 16 years every Sunday going to worship in the local schoolhouse, and after those 16 years, it was time for change. Our growing mission at that point needed an actual church. And so we built a wood frame church on Mill Street, just around the corner from here. And in the records, it says it was built of plank and timbers hewn by hand. And in that new wooden church that they built, the choir had their own balcony at the back. They sat at the back and sang from the back behind the congregation. Why? Because in those days, we believed that the purpose of the choir was to support the congregational singing, not to lead it, but to support it. So they sang behind the congregation. And in 1865, we built stone walls around that old wooden church. And that old stone church is still around the corner from us on Mill Street. You probably drive by it all the time, and unless you've been a longtime member of this congregation, you may not realize that that stone church on Mill Street was our home for about 100 years. Now, that stone church on Mill Street originally had no Sunday school rooms. There was no place back then for our children's educational programs, which were important to Methodists. So in 1880, again, almost some 40 years later, or 20 years later, we built the Sunday school building on the back of the church. And we also moved the choir loft from the back of the church at that point to the front of the church behind the pulpit. Now, when I say it like that, it makes it sound like it was no big deal. Okay, so, in 1880, when they built the Sunday school, the choir moved from the back of the room to the front of the room. Sounds like not a big deal. Well, it was a huge deal. We can't imagine today what it would be like to have a choir behind us instead of at the front. When we picture a church, we picture the choir loft being at the front of the room facing us. And we just can't picture a congregation looking any different than that because that's the way it's always been, right? No, that's not the way it's always been. So at the front back then, there would have been no place for the choir. There would have been nothing up at the front of the room other than the pulpit, the lectern, and the table. That's it. So in order to move the choir from the back to the front, they would have had to remove the pulpit, the lectern, and the table. They would have had to undergo massive renovations at the front of the church to build a platform for all of these things, to build a choir loft, rows for the pews for the choir to sit in. All of that would have had to have been constructed at the front of the church. They would have had to take rows of pews out to make room for that, and then put the pulpit and the lectern and the table back again. That's a massive upheaval just to move the choir from the back of the room to the front of the room. Why did they do that? Well, they did that because they believed that the role of the choir had changed from supporting the congregation to leading the congregation. So the choir needed to be up in front of us, we believed at that point, facing us as the congregation, not behind us, supporting us. So after 40 years of worshiping one way, we had to go through substantial renovations and upheaval in order to change how we worshiped, because our mission demanded it. But otherwise, our worship back then would have resembled a lot like what we know traditional worship to look like and sound like today, right? With the choir and the pipe organ. That's the way it would have been, right? Nope. Actually, you might find this hard to believe. Our church didn't get its first pipe organ until 40 years later in 1922. So what did we use in that old stone sanctuary in the traditional church for all that time up to 1922 for our worship music? For our first 100 years as a congregation, we had no pipe organ. I can't find any record of what we actually had, but most likely it was probably a foot-pumped manual reed organ, something like this. Now, take note as you're listening to this, if the organist stops pumping her feet, that organ stops playing. She has to keep pumping her feet the whole time to make it work. And before that, in the old schoolhouse, we probably just had an upright piano. In 1948, there was a population boom here in Waterdown, and our Sunday school was starting to burst at the seams. So we built an extension onto the Sunday school wing in order to accommodate the extra kids. But that wasn't enough. And we'd run out of land in order to expand the building further, but we didn't have room for everybody. By 1953, we had over 400 children in our Sunday school program. And there was no room, literally no room left to expand. So what did? We ended up purchasing additional property, additional land behind the Mill Street Church to build a further addition onto the Sunday school wing for the rapidly growing congregation. But that still wasn't enough. So we started renting a hall across the street, but that still wasn't enough. We needed a bigger building. We were outgrowing it, and we had nowhere left to grow, even with purchasing extra land. We'd maxed out our space. So in 1954, we began searching for new property, and we found this property where we are today on Parkside. And a year later, in 1955, the decision was made to sell the old stone building, and construction began on the new Christian education wing for our current church. So in 1957, at the dedication of this new Christian education wing that I'm standing in now, our current hall on Parkside, Reverend Dr. Lockington wrote these words: we feel our present needs are well looked after with adequate planning for the future. So we moved in here and started worshiping here in this room. The sanctuary that we know now had not been built yet. It was not completed for another 4 years, not till 1961. In her anniversary address in 1996, Jean Wilson, who I quoted earlier, again says, "Amidst some controversy, for change comes hard to us all, the decision was made to build a new church building on Parkside." Now, when Jean says amidst some controversy, she's kind of glossing over just how controversial it was to sell the old building and move in here at that time. You know, we look at our gorgeous sanctuary today and we wonder how in the world that could ever have possibly been a controversial decision. Well, people couldn't see in their minds what had not yet been constructed yet. Even with drawings, not everybody can imagine what it's going to look like when it's finished. Reverend Norm Buchanan, who was minister at the time of this building's dedication in 1961, he said this, "A number of proposals to extend the facilities of the old building on Mill Street proved impractical. So in spite of a very natural reluctance to leave the fine old church that had served it for more than 100 years, the congregation decided to move to a new site and erect a new church." Now, read between the lines of his comments there. When he says a natural reluctance, he's glossing over it as well. It's an understatement. We have a congregation who has been worshiping in the same beautiful building for a century, 100 years. That's several generations. But we outgrew our building. Now, can you just imagine what that would have been like at the time? People would have been jumping up and yelling, "Hey, my great-grandfather helped build this place. There's no way I'm going to be a part of selling it in my lifetime and dishonor his memory. There's got to be a better way to do this." I could just imagine that's what the meetings would have been like. But the truth was, there wasn't a better way. We had tried everything at that point. We added a new wing. We outgrew that. We expanded that wing. We outgrew that. We purchased more land to build another new wing. We outgrew that. We rented the hall across the street. We outgrew that. We had tried everything. Now, take note, through all of this, there's absolutely no record that we had outgrown the sanctuary. It was the Sunday school that was the problem. It was our lack of facilities for our children and our young families that drove us to move from that beautiful old building to here. And what did we build first when we moved into this site, when we purchased this land? What did we build first? Not the sanctuary. We built the Christian education wing for the children first. We built the children's classrooms first. In the spirit of our old Methodist roots, we put our mission needs first, and we walked away from that gorgeous old stone sanctuary to worship in a dull, gray, cinder block cube of a hall for 4 years. Why? Because we believed our mission to serve the young families of Waterdown was more important than the beauty of our worship space, or more important than our own comfort in worship. Again, Norm Buchanan in 1961 said, "As it stands today, the center reflects the wise planning of the building committee and the architect." Now, Norm was right. We did do a beautiful job with this. I can't tell you, the building committee and the architect, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are shocked to realize that this, the sanctuary, is in fact the newest part of the building newer than that. Because with the old stone style construction, this part of the building, which was built in 1961, it looks like it's 100 years older than it actually is. But the world didn't stop changing in 1961. We thought we had built a new building that would serve our needs for many generations to come. Yet, we didn't think of the question of how does somebody in a wheelchair go to the bathroom if they're in the sanctuary for worship? That's a pretty glaring oversight. But there was something else on the horizon that nobody could have predicted at that time. In 1963, the annual report indicated that Sunday school attendance had dropped to 80% of what it had been the previous year. The next year, it dropped to 60%. And this represented the first decline in attendance ever. And after those years of dramatic increase where we kept outgrowing and outgrowing and outgrowing and outgrowing, to suddenly turn around just a few years later, just 2 years after moving in here, and start to see rapid drops in attendance was startling and shocking for people. At the time, we blamed it on the new Sunday school curriculum. But it wasn't the Sunday school curriculum. It was something much bigger than that that was going to affect our congregation and the entire United Church of Canada, and in fact, every other mainline church in North America and beyond for the next 2 or 3 generations. We call it the Great Exodus, or the collapse of Christendom. People were abandoning church in droves. It wasn't the new curriculum. This was happening everywhere. The church was no longer seen as necessity. It was optional. Up till that generation, people went to church because they thought they were supposed to. It was an obligation. You went because your parents told you to. But in the 60s, people stopped listening to their parents telling them go to church. They just stopped. People were losing faith in the church and in religion in general. It had become irrelevant and out of date. The evangelical churches in the 70s and 80s put mission ahead of personal comfort and began to adapt their worship services towards younger families that we were losing rapidly. They were following our old Methodist principles, and they started to add guitars and drums to their worship services and started getting rid of organs. The founders of Methodism, John and Charles Wesley, they used to, back in their day, they used to go into the pubs to find current songs that people were singing and a way to reach them. And they'd rewrite the words to these songs and make them about God and Jesus. And they'd use those songs to try to entice people out of the pubs and into church by singing familiar songs that people sang every day, not high classical stuff that was being used in the Anglican churches at the time. It was honestly the birth of the contemporary worship movement 200 years ahead of its time. And it was our own spiritual ancestors who did it. And it took us in the United Church of Canada until the 1990s to finally follow their lead and start introducing drums and guitars into worship. But our people were stubborn, and they wouldn't give up. We wouldn't give up our traditions in order to serve the mission of the church. So instead of transforming our worship, like the evangelical churches had done, we ended up with 2 streams of worship, contemporary and traditional. The attitude of the mainline churches was kind of, hey, I'm all right with change as long as it doesn't happen to me, as long as it happens to somewhere else and I don't actually have to change myself. And that wasn't just here. I'm not saying this is about us. This was across the United Church, across the mainline, across North America. We weren't alone. And our two-track, contemporary and traditional, side by side, separate but equal, that worked for a while, until the division stopped being about mission and became about style. And that brings us to today. Looks a little different, doesn't it? It's a work in progress, but boy, our guys have been working at breakneck speed. Unbelievable how much work they've accomplished. Today, God is calling us to worship together again for the first time in about 30 years. God is blessing us with new young families who want to learn from our traditions, but they also want to worship in the full joy of the Spirit with music forms that are familiar to them. Well, except they aren't they. They are us. We are they. We, together, want to bridge the divides that formerly separated us. We want both and, not either or. We want to be together. And that requires bringing two different ways of doing worship together in one room. A room that was only designed for one of those ways to worship. Our ancestors tried to build for the future, and they did a really good job based on the future that they could predict from that time. They couldn't have predicted where we are today. And coming together requires us all to give up something to make this work. And we all gain something from each other in return. Because that's what it means when we say, love your neighbor as yourself, and we want to put that into action. It means that the other's needs are equal to our own. So again today, we're putting mission ahead of our traditions and ahead of our personal comforts. And we're making changes again for the very same reason that we did back in 1957, 61 actually, 57, 53, 48, 1992, 1880, 1865, 1843, 1827, and yes, 1796. All of those are times in the history of our own church where we went through massive change and upheaval in order to put mission first. Because the mission needs of our congregation demand that our facilities serve our mission, not the other way around. We also recognize that today, it's foolish stewardship for our resources to have a room like this that can only be used 1 hour a week. It's not just foolish, it's downright irresponsible to waste this resource. So we're also making some changes to make this room more functional. It's still going to look beautiful, but it will be significantly more functional. In fact, multifunctional. It's going to look kind of something like this. You know, for about 200 years, our congregation has worshiped in 5 different buildings. And we have modified those buildings to serve our mission needs more times than I can count. And now we're doing it again. If we have learned one thing over the last 18 months, it is that the church is not the building. The church is the people. The building is here to serve our mission, not the other way around. Jean Wilson said it well in 1996 when she said this, "Change comes hard to us all." Yes, it does, Jean, you're right. And that warrants compassion towards those who are struggling with this change. They deserve our love and our support. They deserve a COVID-safe hug if you can. But God said it even better than Jean, and I hope Jean doesn't mind me saying so, in the words of the prophet Isaiah. And again, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm doing a new thing. It's bursting forth right in your midst. Can't you see it? Hostility and danger may be all around you, but I'm showing you a new path that will lead to long-term blessing. Fear not, for I am with you through all of this. You know, the world is becoming dangerous enough that churches are closing weekly in the United Church because they have not adapted to the changing mission needs which have become highlighted in this pandemic. But we here at St. James, we're making hard choices to adapt our building to better serve our mission based on what we've learned over the last 18 months. God says, I'm doing a new thing. It's bursting forth right in your midst. Can't you see it?